So last week I talked about the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, as founded by the total of 18 women, including Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin and her daughters Margarita, Harriet, and Sarah. I did put the wrong Charlotte Fortin in the presentation. What seems to be insanely confusing amongst men and women of the mid 1800s is that everyone names their children the same names, and then they all kind of continue to get married, and researching them is difficult, so I don't know what I was doing, but this is Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin. I wanted to talk about the other Charlotte Fortin in a couple of slides, Charlotte Fortin Grimme. But because of the combination of last names and etc., I got confused. But anyway, this was the first American abolitionist organization founded by women, and really sort of saw, again, like I said last week, the abolitionist as well as the suffragette movement really started by Black suffragettes such as Harriet and Sarah and their mother Charlotte. They also helped build the Pennsylvania Hall, which is here on the right, top right, which was an important city of abolitionist activity, but burned down in 1838 in the midst of a white mob violence, which is pretty awful. But here that is as well. In about 1854 in Philadelphia, we have the National Women's Rights Convention, which is a very famous meeting of women in Philadelphia in the 50s. And one of the main speakers is Ernestine Louise Rose. She was chosen as the president of this cause, even though she was an atheist. Susan B. Anthony said every religion or none should have an equal right on the platform. Rose spoke at the gathering saying, "Our claims be based on that great and immutable truth and the rights of all humanity. For as women not included in the phrase, all men are created equal, tell us, ye men of the nation, whether women is not included in the declaration in that great Declaration of Independence." So calling out the Declaration of Independence and the inclusion of women in sort of the suffragette movement by Rose here, who was a Black suffragette. It's also interesting that the Bible is a big part of conversations about abolition and suffrage. So, for example, you have Henry Grew, who is here saying that biblical phrases and passages say that women are supposed to be subordinate to men. Lucretia Mott saying, "The pulpit has been prostituted, the Bible has been ill-used. Instead of taking the truths of the Bible in corroboration of the right, the practice has been to turn over its pages to find examples and authority for the wrong." And so we not only have this being the case for trying to keep women subordinated, but also for trying to keep different races subordinated as well. So Harriet Fortin Purvis, who was a big figure in the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, who we just saw earlier, is a very famous suffragette from that time, as well as abolitionist. And she marries Robert Purvis, who's here on the right. Ironically enough, her sister marries James Purvis, and so inherently, again, we have two sisters who marry two brothers and thus have the same sort of combined last name. So even that is confusing on its own. But Harriet marries Robert, and he was a big part of the American Equal Rights Association and president of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He is right here. Although it's pretty hard to tell in this photograph, as these all seem to be very white figures. Robert Purvis was half Black. His mother was Moroccan and his father was European. And so he had, even though he had a very light complexion, he was very much part of the Black community and the anti-slavery movement. And so he was a large part of that, along with Harriet Fortin Purvis. I believe I just said that backwards. But both of them helped to found the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 as well as the Library Company of Colored People. So here you see some of those texts. I believe his name is in here on the left. There he is. And there's the American Anti-Slavery Society as well. So, other figures that were important to this society also included Sarah Parker Raymond, who was a famous orator and free woman in Massachusetts and became an international activist at 16 years old. And she becomes a physician as well. Her and her brother, Charles, spoke at the National Women's Rights Convention in New York City in 1858, and made a very famous speech at that convention. Unfortunately, she becomes really discouraged by the split of women's suffrage movement after the Civil War, and she leaves the United States to go to Florence, Italy, where she continued to practice medicine and sort of feel more supported and equal in Italy, which is quite tragic. But you can't really blame her for that either. As we've talked about previously, Sarah and Angelina Grimme were very famous white abolitionists in their creepy sort of bonnet selves. But they were part of a slave owner family, and however, they taught slaves how to read. And they have an interesting story of their own. Their brother, Henry Grimme, was a slave owner, and he begins a relationship with Nancy Weston, who I believe is pictured here, who was a slave. Again, it's kind of hard to find good photographs of some of these people early on. They start a relationship and they have 3 sons, Francis, Archibald, and John. And when Henry passes, his family makes his sons slaves in their household into the end of the Civil War, when abolition occurs, and they're sent into higher education, which is pretty tragic. So unfortunately, these boys who grew up with a father who kind of moved out of the slave field and married this woman, or had a relationship with this woman, in fact, believed to be loving, it could have been otherwise. They are unfortunately forced into slavery and then become part of the abolitionist movement. Angelina and Sarah do find out later about their nephews at a convention and regarded them as full members of the family and did open their home to them because I believe they were homeless for an amount of time. So the family does retake them in, which is good. So we have Francis Grimme, who's here on the right. This is him on the left, but here on the right here. He marries Charlotte Fortune Grimme, who I had in the previous PowerPoint, who is the niece of Harriet Purvis, Margaretta, and Sarah Fortune. So the daughter of the other Charlotte Fortune's sister. That makes sense. So these 2 abolitionists and Charlotte Fortune Grimme also being a suffragette. It's kind of crazy that this name gets carried on from these sort of white slave owners into these sort of very famous Black abolitionists. And you can imagine that's also because you have slave owners raping Black slaves as well. So not necessarily as potentially positive as Nancy Weston's sort of story is. But Charlotte Fortune Grimke's family sends her to Salem, Massachusetts, because children were not allowed into public schools where they were living. And she becomes associated, I had this in here. She becomes associated with the American Women's Suffrage Association, run by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, who are married here at the top. So she becomes a major figure in the AWSA, along with a bunch of other figures. So as we talked about with the split, you have a lot of these Black female abolitionists being part of the AWSA group versus the NWSA, as you can imagine. And she's going to go on to tutor 2 very famous other female abolitionists as well. We're going to talk about one of them right now and one of them in a little bit. So Charlotte here, on the left, tutors Anna Julia Cooper, who was a very famous Black woman who was the 4th woman to ever receive a doctoral degree in 1924 in the United States. People often called her the mother of Black feminism because of her book, A Voice from the South, by a Black woman of the South. And she has some very famous quotes from that book in her life. Authoring one of the earliest book-length analyses of the unique situation of Black women in the United States, Cooper offers clearly articulated insights about racialized sexism and sexualized racism without ignoring the significance of class and labor, education and intellectual development, and conceptions of democracy and citizenship. With an academic training deeply rooted in the history of Western philosophy and the classics, Cooper's philosophical significance also lies in her foundation contributions to feminist philosophy, standpoint theory, and epistemology, as well as critical philosophy of race and African American philosophy. So basically what this is saying, as it's quite wordy, is that she became a big figure in philosophy with her doctorate in philosophy, and really developed a very critical economic, social conversation about abolition and suffrage in this A Voice from the South, this very famous work, which is why she has earned the title sort of the mother of Black feminism. She's famous for some other quotes such as, "I see not why there should be not an organized effort for the protection and elevation of our girls such as the White Cross League in England. English women are strengthened and protected by more than 12 centuries of Christian influences, freedom, and civilization. English girls are dispirited and crushed down by no such all-leveling prejudice as the supercilious caste spirit in American, which cynically assumes a Black woman cannot be a lady. English womanhood is beset by no such snares and traps as betray the unprotected, untrained colored girl of the South, whose only crime and dire destruction often is her unconscious and marvelous beauty. There is a feminine as well as a masculine side to truth, and these are related not as inferior and superior, not as better or worse, not as weaker or stronger, but as complements in one necessary and symmetric whole," which is a fantastic quote just about males versus females as a whole. And her final quote, "The old subjective, stagnant, indolent, and wretched life of a woman has gone. She has as many resources as men, as many activities beckon her on, as large possibilities swell and inspire her heart." She became such a famous orator for Black women and for the suffragette movement, and she dies at 105, which is an insanely long time to live, especially for that time period and even today. So she was able to carry this on for a very long time. Such a phenomenal figure. Grimke was joined by a lot of other figures in the AWSA. Charlotte Lottie Rowland was one of them. She said, "We all believe in women's rights and have had the assistance of the best and purest and not the noisiest of our sex. We ask suffrage not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right based on the grounds that we are human beings and as such entitled to all human rights." She was part of the Rowland sisters as well, which was a group of 5 women who all really focused on universal suffrage, speaking at the Southern Carolina House of Representatives in 1869, and argued for women's rights to vote. In March of 1869, she argued that women's suffrage before the State House of Representatives, making the case that the Constitution did not define voters as male, therefore women should be permitted. Other figures included Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was the first ever Black woman to have a novel published, Illo Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, as it is also known. She is very famous, again, as an orator in the National Women's Rights Convention in May of 1866. She gives a number of speeches, which is the 11th National Women's Rights Convention. She provided a strong reflection piece for white women to take a look at how they might too be oppressive to people of color. Society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in case of you press him down for 2 centuries, and in so doing, you cripple the moral strength and paralyze the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in a situation of Ishmael, my hands against every man and every man's hand against me. She was also at this meeting where individuals split over the 15th Amendment in 1869, unfortunately, where the AERA, or the American Equal Rights Association, comes to talk about this issue. And she very much stands on the side of Frederick Douglass and the AWSA, as she is a founding member of this group. Frederick Douglass said that the vote for Black men was a matter of life or death, in part due to lynching in the United States. Watkins Harper agreed, saying if the National could handle one question, she would not have the Black women put a single straw in the way, if only the men of the race could obtain what they wanted. I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that, like men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. Again, seems vaguely familiar. She even said in 1893, what we need today is not simply more voters, but better voters. And so she really stood as this beacon that she was supporting the suffrage of Black men, knowing that, as many historians have stated kind of today, that there was no possible way that white women were going to be given the right to vote before Black men in general, because in giving white women the vote, they had to also recognize that of course meant the black women, and that to some extent it meant Black men too. If they were going to include white women, it kind of meant that they were going to have to include everybody, and there was no way that they wanted everybody to be able to vote, especially in this sort of white supremacist society that existed. And Harper saw that, knowing that the first step would be getting the right for Black men to vote, especially because of lynching issues, as Frederick Douglass said. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was another big figure in AWSA who worked in the Women's Suffrage Association in Massachusetts, as well as this group. And she actually joined the AWSA because of the warm welcome she received from Lucy Stone and other groups, and urged Black and white women to come together. She edited the Woman's Era newspaper, which was the first ever newspaper published by a Black woman. She sarcastically told her audience that because men were so opposed to women's suffrage, that not for many years has so much enthusiasm and interest been shown in support of women's voting rights. So making sort of a joke about because men are so opposed to women voting, that women are more excited about voting, which is funny. This is her newspaper as well here. And another one that feels very poignant today, which is quite sad, maybe, that she's speaking in the 1800s. If laws are unjust, they must be continually broken until they are altered. During this time, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin and Mary Church Terrell, who we'll talk about shortly, found the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, and later becomes the NACWC, but it was founded in 1896. And this becomes a very important group as they support women getting into different political groups. You have some major figures like Coraline Franklin Cook. She addressed Susan B. Anthony saying, "And so, Miss Anthony, on behalf of the hundreds of colored women who wait and hope with you for the day when the ballot shall be in the hands of a very intelligent woman, and also in behalf of the thousands who sit in darkness, in whose condition we shall expect those ballots to better, whether they be the hands of white women or Black, I offer you my warmest gratitude and congratulations," which is supposed to be very sarcastic, if you didn't gather. Other figures included Hester C. Jeffrey, who was another founding member of this group. Even Harriet Tubman comes and speaks to the NACW. I am going to be so bad at acronyms by the end of this. I feel like I should make a key, because these groups are hard to remember. Harriet Tubman comes to be a keynote speaker for the first meeting of this group. And hopefully you have an idea of who Harriet Tubman is. Excuse me. She escaped slavery and made 13 missions to rescue about 70 enslaved people through the Underground Railroad, and also fought in the American Civil War as a spy for the Union Army. As you can see at the bottom of this photograph, that says Nurse, Spy, and Scout during the Civil War, among other things that she did as well. In her later years, Tubman started working to promote women's suffrage, working alongside figures like Susan B. Anthony, pre sort of separation between the groups. When asked if she believed in women's suffrage, she stated, "I suffered enough to believe it." This group, the NACW, also had the very powerful motto of lifting as we climb, and it's been adopted by several groups now as well, as you can imagine, but showing that their climb for equality encompassed all women, and so not just Black women or white women, that it was about lifting and continuing to lift up one another as they moved up in gaining equal rights.